Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to discuss the 5 keys to creating ROI with AI. Today, we'll be discussing guidelines that data-driven teams can use to set the foundation for a successful AI project, or really any advanced analytics project that your team is kicking off. There is a question queue, the one that's labeled Q&A, not the chat function. If you'd like to ask us questions, please do so there so that we can minimize disruption. And we'll save those for the end in the discussion section. If we don't get to your question today, don't worry, we're going to follow up with everyone after the session. So to get started, I am Erica Fowler, Product Marketing Manager at Molecula. I have a PhD in epidemiology. It's where I discovered my love of data and analytics. And I've spent about the last 12 years or so in strategy and analytics across multiple industries, primarily in the healthcare sector. I'm here with my colleague, Jamie Pope, Director of Solution Engineering at Molecula. Jamie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks, Erica. Hi, I'm Jamie Pope, Director of Solution Engineering here at Molecula. I've spent the last 20 or so years in around engineering and architecture. The majority of my career was spent in banking and finance, where I managed teams of really talented people who built some super cool applications. I'm a massive Liverpool football supporter. You're welcome, Andy. Mediocre golfer, but above all else, I'm a data junkie. I love all things data related, and more importantly, helping my customers realize the business value of the data they have on hand. I'm looking forward to chatting with you today. I've also invited my colleague, Garrett Roshka, along with me today, and he will be here helping with the questions you drop in our queue. You may see him answering while we're chatting. Thanks for the assist, Garrett.
All right. So we have an interactive session planned for you today. Jamie's going to tell you about Molecula and our mission. We'll do a couple of polls throughout the session to better understand you and why you joined us today. We'll have that ongoing Q&A with Garrett in the chat function, and then we'll discuss our 5 keys to ROI with AI, 1 bonus key, and then we'll get to those questions at the end. So I'll turn it over to Jamie for that Molecula introduction.
Thanks again. Molecula is an enterprise feature storage system with a vision to help humans and machines make better decisions. We believe that data should be accessible to everyone to empower those decisions, which is why we built the product. In 2011, Mark Andreessen wrote his famous essay, Why Software is Eating the World, and I believe that ship has sailed. Software ate the world many times over. We use so many applications now that we've forgotten the world before. We use apps for banking, healthcare, how we shop, travel, and the list goes on. In fact, I can't imagine my life without the applications I use every day. Behind all of these applications we depend so heavily on is mountains of data. We're producing more data than we can possibly quantify, and managing that data, moving that data from place to place, and getting it into a state suitable for ML and AI is time-consuming, frustrating, and can be very expensive. We have moved into an age where we use data for insights into our business with the hope we can do machine learning and AI, but statistics are telling us that we are failing more often than not. Today, we'd like to talk with you about being smarter with your data projects and keys to your data project success. Finally, we will chat with you about a better way, a new approach to how Molecula can power your models at speed.
All right, thank you, Jamie. That brings us to our first poll. So before we get started, what best describes your organization's maturity in AI/ML right now? Please select the best answer for your organization. You're not considering AI/ML. You're evaluating business cases that may benefit from it. You're starting to build and develop AI models. You've already built models and you're working on getting those into production, or you already have models up and running. All right. So it looks like got a pretty good split here. So we have about 58% of our respondents are evaluating business cases that would benefit from AI or ML. So I'm glad to have you all here today. I think that the keys to success that we'll be talking about will definitely be beneficial to you. They are pretty high level, but I think that even data engineers, data scientists, as we'll talk about later, can definitely benefit from these higher level recommendations. So Jamie, were you surprised by those results?
I wasn't. I was actually pretty enlightened with the ones that are in production. As you know, we got some statistics that say that that's pretty rough to do. So kudos to you if you do have some models running in production.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So thanks for sharing that, and we're going to jump in. So Gartner reports that half of CIOs say that they now employ AI or intend to within the next 12 months, but 87% of data science models never make it into production. If you're a data engineer or data scientist, you know that that stat's a little bit fluffy. We're not quite sure where it came from. But you also know that it's not the models that are the problem. They're more accurate than ever. It's that full infrastructure that's needed to put those models into production that's usually lacking. And to be real, there really aren't that many companies truly doing AI right now. I think 20% of you just reported that you have models into production. But the ones that are really doing AI, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, they've been at this for decades. They've treated data as their number one most valued possession for over 20 years. And that treatment and prioritization has laid the foundation for them to actually put AI into action. So, you know, it's important to note again that what we'll cover today isn't just for AI, it's relevant to pretty much any complex analytics project. Jamie, do you have anything to add here in this statistic?
That's awesome. Well, you know, our friends at Gartner also released the hype cycle for emerging tech a few weeks ago, and AI was heavily represented. However, if you look at the chart, most of the data points say that we're still 5 to 10 years out. And a few fell into 2 to 5, but that's still some time. Another report I read by FeatureBase stated that 9% of machine models never make it to production, right? That's 1 out of 10 of those models that you all work so hard on never really make it into production. And yet another report states that 91% of tech executives believe AI will be at the center of the next tech revolution. So why is that? Why is it so difficult to really do this right? And in my experience, there are many reasons. We're going to chat about a few of them today, but one, and just to throw this right out there, a no-brainer, it's hard. And there's a lot of pitfalls along the way that we'll chat about. In my case, my biggest culprit was proper project scoping. It was kind of new, and so getting a project scope correct was difficult. But getting my data into a state that I could actually make use of was the biggest problem. Of the teams I managed in the past, I'd say that 75 to 80% of our time was devoted to just getting our data where we needed it to be before we could actually execute on it. I don't know why I said this, but I called that release-related activities because we were trying to push these models out to production. And building and maintaining data pipelines was a huge piece of that puzzle that took so much of our time. So I think some of these statistics are really around how hard it is to get our data in a state that we can actually make sense of it.
Absolutely. So we'll definitely be talking about that in the next slides. So with that, I'll move to our first key to success. So number one, ensure that your business outcomes are crystal clear. So identify an executive sponsor. You're going to hear us come back to that many times today. Ensure that the end deliverable is actually usable within your current architecture or the new planned architecture. Define your success criteria and a measurement plan for the success of the project within your organization. And then schedule planned check-ins with your stakeholders and that executive sponsor throughout the life cycle of the project. So many times expectations are unrealistic for these projects. A model in itself typically won't solve a business problem, but it's a tool that your smart people in your organization can use to help address those. You need the strategy around that to make sure that you're actually making progress towards that business problem. And then Jamie, I'm sure you've had experience with this, defining what success looks like for your project at the outset and making sure that you're able to demonstrate that success to leadership is important, not only for this project, but getting new ones in the future. And then I know that you're passionate about this, so scheduled and planned check-ins with stakeholders along the way.
Absolutely. I can't stress enough how important executive sponsorship is first, right out of the gate. Most of my successful projects had really strong executive sponsors behind them. And the reason that was so important for me is because it aligned the business unit goals with the projects that we were driving. If we didn't line up with the business's goals, a lot of these side projects didn't get the attention that they needed, and having that executive sponsorship right up front that aligned with their goals was critical to that happening, especially as data flow increased with all the stuff that we've seen come in. I've seen so many projects crash and burn because of misalignment with business goals. And that one is a huge hurdle, but your executive sponsor can absolutely state what those are up front and make sure that everybody is aligned with the business goals. And those competing priorities inside of the enterprise, when your executive sponsor is behind your project, some of those, go knock on another door, we can't help you today, kind of go away, right? Having said all of that, a third of business executives polled in a recent study blamed poor deployment statistics on a lack of senior buy-in, right? So even our executives are saying that they need executive alignment to make these things see through to fruition.
Absolutely. And, we all know a project can morph and change as you're going on. So having those check-ins and making sure that they're established and expected is really important to keep you on track and ahead of some of those changes that you might see from the business or the tech side. So that's a great lead in, Jamie, actually, to our second key to success. And this is to ruthlessly scope your project. So gain alignment from all of your stakeholders, not only that executive sponsor and the business that you're supporting, but the people on the ground, the people actually doing the work. Define clear milestones and the deliverables associated with those. Consider both your human and your IT resources and plan for scope changes. So as Jamie mentioned, these are cross-functional efforts. People from multiple teams are needed and they all have competing priorities. So having that executive backing is really important to the success of your project. Not only to make sure that you're on track, but to make sure that you're meeting the needs of the business, and then they can come in and push your project as a priority. And then, as Jamie mentioned, the scoping is notoriously difficult. You've got people that you're dealing with, processes, technology, resources across multiple parts of your organization. They all come with costs, and sometimes those costs are difficult to quantify and the resources are really scarce. Also, if the scoping phase doesn't include some input from cross-functional teams, the effort needed to accomplish this project might be over or understated, usually understated. And having that business outcome clearly defined can help you with scope creep. So I know that I've encountered a lot of scope busters in my life. Jamie, how about you? What kind of things have kind of blown up the scope of some of your projects that are good to watch out for?
There are people who know me on the phone that I like to talk, and I could really ramble here about specific projects and where we got outside of what initially was planned for. But one that's top of my mind, many years removed from project completion, by the way, it was that bad, was the great synthetic data episode, as we called it internally. We had a project that had a really aggressive delivery date. In fact, in retrospect, that date shouldn't have made it, but there was a lot of pressure from our business unit and the need was there. So we quickly spun up our teams and planned out all of our work. We knew the systems we had to augment, where new builds were needed, resources from teams were contacted, their time was accounted for, all the things that you think would lead to great success, including superb executive sponsorship. A little over a quarter way through our project, we found out real quick that some of the data we needed to use was heavily regulated and privacy laws prohibited our use in lower level environments, which, let's be honest, is where we spend 85% or more of our time, right? Is down those lower levels. This should have been an easy one for us because we were pretty good at data obfuscation and redaction at that time. But in this case, some of the data we needed was owned by a third party, which wasn't abnormal in banking, but our data privacy teams weren't allowed to take action on the data contractually, meaning we couldn't use our own teams to cleanse the data for our use. And I wouldn't classify this as scope creep at this point because we were quite sure we had the needed agreements in place to take action on the data. But getting to the bottom, what was proving to be harder than we thought, we were losing time. Here's where the scope changed for our project. We decided we didn't have the time to wait for the third party to do what was needed, and the business needed to be delivered. We knew the data models, so we set off to fabricate data sets we could use while we waited for that stuff to be sorted out. There were internal teams who could take that work, but they were not part of our project. Their time was not accounted for. And now we were scrambling to get the right people, process and tools to get this work done, and the project quickly spun to the great synthetic data debacle that I'm talking about. I'm sure most of us are familiar with value stream mapping. I really like it. I talk a lot about it. Folks probably get sick of me talking about it, in fact. But if you're not, when you're doing a value stream mapping exercise, you focus on areas of weight, waste, and rework. And when our projects aren't scoped properly, we can quickly find ourselves lost in one of these, as I call them, value stream chasms. So back to my example, our project failed to include the time, which is weight, it would take to sanitize our data, and more importantly, the human cost associated with that work. Our scope crept way outside the project, and to find the resource and tools, et cetera, to overcome our data issues was insurmountable, and we did slip. Our delivery was very lengthy, Erica, very lengthy.
Definitely. Those legal hurdles and data use agreement hurdles are always tricky. I've definitely been in some project situations where we were delayed weeks or even months just because we had the data in hand, but we weren't allowed to use it for certain reasons. Other things that might happen, like data might be buried in a critical system somewhere and it costs to get the data out, and then there's ongoing tech costs there. I think one thing is for sure, scope creep is going to happen. So it's really important to have a plan for scope changes, know how much change you're going to tolerate and include those changes in the assessment of the success of the project when it deviates from plan. So I think typically projects I've been involved in they start out as one and then they end up phased out in like 1, 2, 3, 4+ phases because of this scope creep. But like I said, as long as if you have a plan for it, you're going to be better off than if you don't.
Absolutely. Try to build in that buffer time, have a quick feedback loop, operate agile and make sure that you're staying in touch. Back to our former slide where those pull-ups and check-ins are scheduled and they're pretty frequent.
Absolutely. And that flows nicely into the next one is keep it real with your timelines. So the top graphic is what you think your timeline is going to look like. And the bottom one is, as Jamie mentioned, agile, iterative, kind of all over the place. This is usually what the project timeline actually looks like. So ways that you can mitigate this is have early stakeholder involvement. As I mentioned, those teams with their hands on the keyboard are really important to include in your scoping and timeline process. Make sure that you are aware of any cross-functional resources, or as Jamie mentioned, third-party resources that you might need to contract with that might delay things, or you might need to find them. And then the data availability, as we mentioned, legal requirements, make sure you scope that out early on. And then just keep in mind that this is an iterative process. Jamie, any other things that you can think of on timelines?
Absolutely. And I could be wordy again if everyone, I'm sure everyone loves that. But the way our projects would start, and it was with a business initiative, which isn't uncommon, I hope, right, for most of us. For example, one I can think of is our customers said we were gathering their information on too many places during an account opening, right? They were filling in the same data over and over again. And we need to consolidate that because they were abandoning the account opening process. Once we defined, we would have a design session and map out our work. So if we back that up to a value stream mapping exercise, we'd identify the people, the process, and the tech need to deliver the final business outcomes. Delivery managers would take the reins after that step, and they'd reach out to the responsible parties needed to actually complete the work. Managers of those teams would assign the needed resources and state the time that they would need to meet their piece of the puzzle. And here's what got a little bumpy usually, because some teams' plates were usually full, while others had needed bandwidth. And this caused some conundrums internally, where a delivery for an application team could be days, and maybe for a data team could be weeks. And there was constant, I would say, bickering internally about that. But internally, there really wasn't enough full-time employees with the demands on the enterprise to take care of some of the projects. And so we started looking at augmenting our staff with partners and contractors, which again isn't uncommon. But that pushed the timeline out, because if you don't know that up front when you reach across the table to your partners and say, hey, I need someone to do X, Y, Z, and you didn't think about that up front, it's going to be a problem, particularly when you're using a new technology for the first time. Which brings me to the final point on this timeline, training. If the technology or tools used are net new, teams have to come up to speed on how to use them and use them effectively. And I experienced that firsthand once on a very complex data replication project where the technology we chose hadn't been deployed before. We were stretching the timeline because no one knew how to really use the tech we bought. We worked use cases in our proof of concept, but our actual deployment was much more complex than our POC was by miles. So that kind of made my graphic look much like this picture that Erica has on this slide. And then I want to touch a little bit, if you don't mind, on understanding and really understanding your organization's process for getting your product from keyboard to production. Erica and I talked about this the other day. I owned and managed an e-commerce data platform at one point. And in my case, we had application developers who aligned to the business, who were writing application code and delivering code through automated builds. We had database engineers who were writing database definition language, for example, to change the schema and make those changes so that the code matched up. And our process was In the lower level environment, when someone wrote SQL for a DDL or DML change, they had to request that through our system. And there was an SLA tacked onto that of 3 days. And that didn't mean that DBAs didn't get to that work immediately, but it did mean on the business side where I sat that I had to extend my project by 3 days each time I added a DDL to there. If it failed at line 1,000 of 200, 2,000 lines, they would close a ticket now back to the 3 days. And these are things that you don't think about when you're building these timelines. You really need to understand the delivery SLAs of the people that you're going to interact with, and where the data is, how it's stored, and who can access it really adds some scrutiny to what you're doing there. I know you probably experienced that too, Erica, where you know the data is there and there's a process to actually get access to it, and that process wasn't factored in to your timelines.
Absolutely. I think we've mentioned it at least twice already, but these are always or almost always iterative processes. So making sure you're padding in time for, various rounds of review or approval or submitting tickets for changes is really important. And I think that actually, Jamie, kind of what you're talking about with contractors and the lead time needed sometimes to get them hired and up to speed brings us nicely to our next key to success is staffing appropriately. So here's a good place where you can engage that executive sponsor. So as we mentioned, this person is very important at all parts of your project. Balance your resources across projects. Jamie mentioned that, a lot of these resources are shared across many projects within an organization. So they're competing priorities sometimes. So be mindful, especially of those scarce skill sets. I know a lot of places are having trouble finding data engineers. There just aren't enough of them. So being mindful of how you can, staff these projects appropriately when there are other priorities happening. And then understand ongoing maintenance needs. So this is one I see missed a lot. So after the project's done, there's going to be sometimes a significant amount of time in making sure that it's operating daily, and that could take time away from those scarce resources. So, this can make or break your project, and it's often helpful or even necessary to engage that executive sponsor and use their weight to get resources assigned, or be a budget evangelist if there's scope creep or you find something that you missed. Jamie, any other examples that you can throw out here?
Absolutely. I love these. I know these are very terse, but so many of these have bit me that I could probably dig into each one of them easily. But, sometimes we're so focused on building new solutions because we're builders and we like to do that we don't consider all the work that needs to happen after launch to make it run day to day, right? So I've delivered the project, now I'm ready to hand it off. But not only are you augmenting your staff to do the work, but you need to consider your support staff and who's going to maintain that day to day, answer your tickets, deal with your customer calls. Do they have the necessary skill sets? There have been times where we had the contractor labor to build our product and get it into production, and then they left. And there wasn't a lot of folks left behind who really understood how to make that happen. And it was very complex. So after we reached production, we would get asked to join triage calls. And there's one project that took us 2 years to build where my staff was getting paged in daily. And when I looked at their time, they were spending the majority of their time on triage calls for the app that took us 2 years to build. This killed my delivery time. So if I was to tie this back into not losing focus and letting your project slip, so I didn't have the staff focused on the projects they needed to be focused on because they were dealing with triage for a product that we turned over before the staff was there to actually take care of it. There's two sides of the project where I came from. There was a business side who owned and funded the initiative, and there was a tech ops side who built and maintained the needed infrastructure to power the applications. The developer and data engineers, they aligned to the business side and they created the code to power the applications. And the tech ops side is responsible for hosting all those said applications. That meant that tech ops was responsible for deploying the needed application and data changes and maintaining what was there. And if that knowledge transfer isn't seamless and if there isn't proper enablement, those things can get out of whack. So I really love the understand ongoing maintenance needs and niche skill sets, Erica, because if it's overlooked, it may not get you at project delivery, but it will bite you once it's out in production.
Absolutely. And I know I've read some articles recently about this very thing happening because of the lack of data engineering talent. Data scientists are having to do more and more of that engineering work. And while they may be fairly good at it, they're not an engineer and they're not often specialized in, very efficient ways to do things. And that's definitely brought down the house a couple of times with some inefficient queries or whatnot. So definitely an issue. And I can't say enough, the maintenance phase after you hit go. I think what I would typically say is it's one thing to plan all of this and like design it. It's a whole other thing to keep it going every day. So very different phases of a project, but both very important.
Absolutely.
And then that brings us to our last key to success before we move on to the bonus. Understand your costs, all of them. We've touched on this throughout the day, but have a realistic view of your labor costs, whether that's internal or upskilled with contractors, your data ingress and egress. Make sure you have a good handle on that and what tools you might need to bring in or fire up to get data from here to there. Any additional technology that you might need to bring in-house to get the job done. And then organizational budget allocation. And this one is really interesting. Jamie, you touched on this, that the IT side of the house is typically the one that is deploying the applications and, managing the architecture. But with the move to technologies like Snowflake, where the usage or the computing costs can be tracked down to that user level, there's some IT organizations that are starting to transfer some of that cost to the actual business unit. So I'm really interested to see how that's going to evolve in terms of how organizations are allocating dollars to and approving projects, et cetera. I mean, we could probably go on and on with this. Jamie, do you have any other examples?
Yeah, I like this one because it's another funny thing that used to happen in the enterprise is the business side, we had our own technology group. We call it the BTG, the business technology group, and we were very impatient. We had things we wanted to do. We talked to vendors and we'd see what they have, and we would make decisions, and we would ask our tech ops partners to help us out with that. And a lot of times we were in queue, and our impatience would lead us to running these POCs and MVPs on our own. And so we would build things on our side of the house because we have architects and engineers and data engineers and scientists and all the folks that you need on the BTG side to build these. But we would build them without the proper understanding of the costs associated with some of these, like clicking a button in the cloud and spending something that, and ingress and egress for your data moves. We didn't really understand the cost initially, and we would see bills at the end that were very surprising to us. A lot of times we build something and we would turn over the build to our IT partners. They'd say, wait a minute, right? We're not going to incur these charges, and your chargeback for this is XYZ. So a lot of time was discussed, to your point, about what are the chargebacks? How does that work? And when there's a new technology like we see with AI and ML and the things that are happening today, it's hard to transpose that. And it's hard to understand what that means and what makes sense to the business. And I think if you focus on the outcomes, like we said initially, you can kind of come up with your models around that and how you do want to charge for that service. But it's a mess, and the budget gets a little dicey when we start throwing new technologies in that we really don't know a lot about, like you said, with the way Snowflake, which we all know about now, but the way those charges happened then was kind of new to us. So it was a surprise.
Definitely. And I know we've been talking a lot about kind of doing work for your own organization or internally, but a lot of this stuff is really relevant if you're in like a consulting role and doing client delivery work from that aspect. So a couple of other things that you might want to consider is whether you're billing for time and materials, so hourly or fixed fee as like for a whole project. So fixed fee can be pretty risky if you don't have a couple of projects under your belt to really understand all of those costs, and you might end up losing money. So a lot of times fixed fee has a pretty good margin rate on it, so you can make a big chunk of money no matter how long it takes. But if you don't really understand those costs before you get into that situation, you could end up scope creep and change orders and re-estimating SOWs, and that can be really challenging. So that's another kind of aspect that we hadn't touched on yet.
Absolutely. And just sometimes if you overthink it, the cost of doing nothing, right, is also something that you realize later when your competitors are beating you to market. And those are just some of the things that fascinated me about, our product and why we're here today. But I don't want to leave that out, that, right, sometimes you want to boil the ocean and your competitors are moving at speed and you're not. And even an MVP product is better than no product. And so a lot of times we've had to just make ourselves get out there and do what's needed.
Yeah, definitely. So now that we've talked about 5 keys to success, even with all of that, if you do all 5 of them right, 80% of your project will be spent wrangling data. So this is a broad term, can encompass a lot of different activities. So it could be securing the access to the data, clearing the legal hurdles that we discussed, setting up data ingress, egress schedules and technologies, translating the data, or it could even be like human processes that are kind of stuck in the middle of this complex technical world that you may not know about, like a person that has to manually enter data every day in this place and kind of disrupts your automation cycle. And then latency or wait is added at every step. And Jamie, I know you like to talk about wait, waste, and rework. So I think this slide is definitely, I'm sure, one of your
Absolutely
favorites.
geared toward there, isn't it? I'm a broken record, but when we talk about that wait, waste, and rework, I think a lot of our exercises as engineers and architects is getting on the whiteboard. I love the whiteboard, but understanding current state, what I'm looking for personally when I'm there is where are we waiting? Where do I see the waste? Where do I see the rework? And what can we do to fix that? And then data is concerned, we did so much work to get our data into a state where we could actually make use of it, that we had all 3 of those, particularly wait, right? We were ensuring it was ready to run analytics and run models, and we had copies and copies of copies, and data was everywhere. There was mountains of data or data sprawl, and we were taking pieces of data from all kinds of sources. We were manipulating it, create more data, and then doing that again to get another copy, and doing that again to meet our needs. And we were doing the rework. So it wasn't just in the wait bucket. It was everywhere. Waste with copies of data everywhere, rework because we're doing the same work again and again and again without automating it. And then the wait time that we waited to just have this in a state that we could actually do something with it. And I always think to myself, well, how valuable is the time to the project, right? Running logic against the data to create a new data sets that are ready to be used. How much of that is rework? What are we doing that we've done before that we can automate? As they say in DevOps, automate everything, right? And so some of this stuff was so hard because data was heavy. And it's a little different when I wrote application code and I would deploy a Java file that changed the UI and it didn't look pretty, right? I could easily redeploy that and fix it. But if I executed some DML that removed 32 million records, getting that back, even in my lower level, was insurmountable, especially when that was created from feeds and seeds from other places, files and streams and relational data models that were running queries again to extract the data that we want and batch. All the things that I did to actually have that data was thwarted when I put it back. I think some of my business leaders would be so happy. They'd say, we always have a backup, and they would talk about their backups and their mean time to repair, but they never practiced putting it back. And I always, wondered, hey, when is this going to bite you? And it did many times where we had records gone. And then when they figured out that, yeah, there's a backup, but it takes 3 days to replay those logs and put them back, things got a little dicey. And I totally, there's so much wait time and waste, and we can do better. We really can.
Yeah, definitely. And then kind of like further downstream from that, you mentioned all the different copies of data and everything. I can't tell you how many times or how many hours I've spent as an analyst trying to explain why report A doesn't match report B, or why data source A doesn't match that, when we could have been solving actual business problems. So yeah, this is definitely, in addition to all of the data cleaning, et cetera, that's something on the other end that can take up a lot of valuable time.
I love that conversation Erica and I had the other day about those reports, when folks see 2 pieces of data that tell a different story and they scratch their head, and then you're scrambling to try to understand and explain why, because you're the expert. Right. And the data is just not there to support it. And I always say that an opinion without data is just an opinion. And so I try to back up those opinions with facts and something that I can put on a slide. And when you have a report that says it's pointing at the same place that's telling 2 different stories, it gets a little confusing for our business constituents, for sure.
So I know that, Jamie, you're excited to get on to our bonus key for success, but first we're going to do one more poll, just really quickly. Which option listed best describes the main reason that limits your organization from considering their AI project successful? Your business problem and your deliverables aren't aligned, the data wrangling, or feature engineering challenges, so creating informative features on that raw data, model training, validation, and documentation, or the production process, the data pipelines, latency, and then our model hosting and serving.
Drum roll.
Ooh, it's kind of spread out.
That's a good spread. Maybe we should take a screenshot of that and put it into the deck. That's some science there. That wasn't what I was expecting. That's awesome.
Definitely. So we've got 23% business problem and deliverables aren't aligned, 23% data wrangling, 23% feature engineering, 15% model training, validation, documentation, and 15% is the production process.
That kind of, aligns with some of the things I thought, particularly around the model training, right? Like we said earlier, the models are there, people are building them, but wrangling that data together and getting it in a state where we can actually train them is very difficult.
Awesome. Well, next, Jamie, I'm going to turn it over to you for our bonus key, adopt a feature-first approach.
Awesome. Thank you. Here at Molecula, we believe that adopting a feature-first approach by shifting continuous real-time feature extraction and updates as close to the data source as possible, that we give your data engineering teams the ability to empower data science and application developers to do their jobs well and increase the likelihood your AI efforts return some benefit to your business. Now I'd like to talk to you about a better way, a new approach to how we can powder your models at breakneck speed. And I'm going to ask you to please, throw away the decades old ideas and associations you have with how to deal with data out the window and find out how FeatureBase is a rocket ship to power your models. I know that I had to, and I'm still doing it today, right? Like I said, I've been an engineer for over 20 years in every clime and place. I like to say that I'm a jack of all trades and a master of none, but I had to flip my brain inside out to kind of get around what we're doing. But I believe organizations have reached a tipping point where the effort needed to enable real-time use cases and make data ready for machine scale analytics and AI far exceeds the value created from it. Think about that for a second. The effort needed exceeds the value created, and that's just not good for business. So FeatureBase is not tackling a better way to run models. FeatureBase solves one key issue in gathering and orchestrating the data in a much more efficient way so that we can serve our models faster, iterate through model building more quickly, and power your ability to make business decisions faster at scale. And if we think about the competition, getting our stuff to market pretty quick is paramount. In the current paradigm, today's methods to improve the data access problem is first utilize any number of methods to pre-process or manipulate data. So if we take a look at this slide, first we'd see that we want to get the data, and this comes from many places: batch, streaming, files, application rights, etc. It's all very siloed. In my case, business units had their own applications and they all had to speak to one another, and pieces of data lived in those, and those silos were there. And getting access to those data was difficult. And that's why we had large batch cycles that ran all night long, or you couldn't drop code between 12 and 4 because that's the batch, hands off, just things that made it very impossible to speed those things to market. Then other teams process and run complex aggregations and store the outputs for later use. While others attempt to solve this issue by federating or pushing the compute problem elsewhere, sometimes to already taxed resources, scheduling time on the machine, for example, to actually run through some of your aggregations because it's already under constraint. Finally, we attempt to force our answers by throwing more infrastructure or human capital at the problem, translating to dollar spend, brute force, like we'll just scale out or up or sideways. FeatureBase enables real-time analytics and AI initiatives by automatically extracting features you care about from data and storing them in concise, optimized format, specifically designed around making features individually available for analysis and easily accessible. We are purpose-built for data science, and our feature-first approach makes model-ready, reusable across the organization without the need to pre-process the data. And I know it's a broken record if you talk to me in the future, but pre-processing the data, we eliminate that. And for me, that's huge and insurmountable. Things can be overcome when I'm not spending so much time up front trying to get my data in a state that I can actually use. Now, if you'll give me 18 seconds of your time for a quick video clip, we'll help level set what we do.
Molecula reduces the dimensionality of data to its simplest form by collapsing conventional data models.
It's pretty quick, wasn't it? Maybe I'll talk about it a little bit.
18 seconds. There we go.
Molecula reduces the dimensionality of data to its simplest form by collapsing conventional data models and abstracting the relationships in the data, creating a highly optimized feature-first data store that maintains data compression when queried, all without copying or moving the raw data itself.
And there's the key, copying or moving the raw data itself. Once we figure out the features that we want to take action on and we put them where we need them, we're ready to move at great speed. And what you see here is a very simple view of FeatureBase's unique format. And that's much more complex than this. I won't fool you, but I want to keep it as something that even I can speak to. The first thing you notice is this binary state that's ready for use in machine learning or artificial intelligence. There's no need to further encode. The top header or columns represent the entities we care about analyzing. And in this case, it's people. The rows here represent the values of a single field or attributes of interest. This could be anything from fact data, such as age, or even a string field containing a person's favorite color. The main and immediate difference most people see is each row maps to one and only one value from the entire attribute possible. So each row could be a distinct color, for example, in this case, red, orange, yellow, or green, and a bit is set for the people that like particular colors. These rows are grouped together, and now you have a field name color. Now, to quickly determine which colors people prefer, you'll need to do is check for where the ones are set and not set. This allows for rapid computation. As you don't have to search through unnecessary elements to find those that you care about. Rather, you compute only on the specific sub-values of interest. In this example, let's say you want to know which people like the color blue. So I choose the center row, which contains only the relationships I care about. I move along that road, and I find the people where the ones intersect. It's really that easy. And there's a lot brighter people who can dig in deeper with you on technical deep dives or feasibility workshops if you'd like to really dig deep. But when I saw this personally, I was like, I need to know more. I need to join the ship. Please let me come and talk about it. And we'd be happy to explore this deeper with you. A lot of smart people that I've mentioned are available to chat with you about the technology and how we power our product. Thanks, Erica.
All right, thank you, Jamie. I can say the same for myself. When I saw what Molecula and FeatureBase were capable of, I also couldn't wait to join the ship. So with that, let's review our 5 keys to creating ROI with AI. So number 1, ensure that your business outcomes are crystal clear. Ruthlessly scope the project and have a plan for scope changes. Keep it real with your timelines, staff appropriately, and understand all of the costs that are associated. And as Jamie mentioned, if you want to learn more about FeatureBase or get more technical, we are always happy to do a demo with you and talk with you about it more. Jamie, do you want to elaborate a little bit?
Absolutely. I have folks on my team who are ready to show you the magic, if you will, help you realize the art of possible, as we say. But we'd be happy to do that at any time. Just let us know. We're at your disposal. Sharing documentation if need, answering your questions. We'd love to dig deep with you. 15 minutes to hours. Just let us know how we can help.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We have been keeping track of your questions. So if your questions weren't answered by Garrett during the program, then we will make sure to follow up. Yeah, but thank you for joining us.
Thanks again.
Hello.
All right. Yeah, go ahead, Derek.
I was just going to jump in and address, William had a great question on the Q&A channel, and he's talking about how do you find good test cases to start modeling on. And it's actually very common. We see this across even very mature organizations. And so specifically retail data, which is what he's working with, there's a lot of rich things you can do with that. But typically, just as a good starting point, I noticed in the poll that there's some challenges with aligning business deliverables to modeling. We usually start with this revenue. And I know that sounds very boilerplate, but it really is. We start with, okay, what predictive elements can help drive revenue? Because that'll be easier to align with your business decision makers and those key team members. We usually would start with, okay, how can this data set produce results that will help us figure out better ways to navigate our customers or navigate or improve how we interact with our customers? and then work backwards from there. And that usually will help us line out how we orchestrate data, how we stitch things together, and really start to bring together the elements we'll need to complete a modeling project. And then start, as you kick off the project, start and work your way forward and stay well aligned, especially if there's changes or, customer behavior over, a 6-month period can change quite rapidly. So that alignment is key, especially as deliverables may be changing.
Garrett, is it safe to say that we like to say start at the end, right? Or I do anyway. I don't know if that's echoed much, but when we know what the outcome that we want to have is, it's much easier for Garrett and I and others to figure out how to model that properly. And a lot of times folks don't know what they want to ask their data. And that's why we're here to help you, gain insight into what's there. But start at the end, I believe, is something I try to keep top of mind.
Yes, especially as you deal with very disparate data sets, which is some of the core challenges we tackle and focus on. It can be quite challenging to bring together 3 to 4 to 5 different sources together, stitch it all together, and make it push to or serve features out of that. So it's critically important to start at the end and work your way backwards in those cases.
Were there any other in there, Garrett, that you wanted to speak about?
No, that was just the main one that I wanted to address. It was a great one. It's a very common challenge we see across every vertical, not just retail. It's IoT devices, traffic forwarding, security, fraud detection. All of them face the same areas with trying to figure out, where do we start? How do we begin to model this and get our hands, especially in between projects, right, with the free time?
Absolutely. Thank you, sir.
All right, with that, thank you everyone for your time. We appreciate it. We will be following up with recording. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Cheers.